ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Ticklish Business, the podcast all about honoring and celebrating old Hollywood. As always, I'm your host, Kristen Lopez, and we are continuing our cinematic vacation known as International Month, where I travel, quote unquote, to different locations based on their classic films. And as we did with the episode with Alicia in Australia, I am visiting the countries where my patrons who have supported me for the last 10 years are from. And our second most populous patron country is, no surprise, Britain. So I did a listener poll. You probably saw it if you're a patron at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. If you aren't, go drop over there and you can vote on fun things like this. And our choices were Kind Hearts and Coronets, Carol Reed's The Third Man, and David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia. And I was actually surprised that The Third Man won. Thank you to everybody that voted, because I don't think I could have fit 3 hours of desert adventure into my schedule this week. And to help us talk about the awesome Carol Reed and 1949's The Third Man, I'm going to try really hard not to call it The Thin Man this episode. I am joined by the awesome Jeremy Fassler. Jeremy, how are you?
Doing great. Thank you, Kristen.
Awesome. For people that don't know you, know your work, tell us a little bit about yourself and what is your connection with classic film?
So, well, first of all, I'm West LA born and raised.
Love it.
I used to live up the street from the Arrow in high school, and my friends used to work there. So I went there for free a lot. So thanks, guys. I'm a journalist based in Washington, D.C., and I mostly cover politics and policy, but I do a lot of cultural writing as well. I've been published in the New York Times. I've written for Vulture on numerous occasions, and I'm the co-author of a book on HBO's Deadwood with Matt Zoller Seitz, which is currently, I believe it's been reissued through his website, MZS Press. So if you're interested or if you're a huge Deadwood stan, check it out.
We love Matt. Matt is awesome. I know that we've talked about that Deadwood book before, so always happy to shout out more Matt Zoller Seitz stuff. Matt needs to be on the podcast. Now that you've brought it up, I need to get him on the show so that we can get both authors down the line.
I'm actually surprised that he hasn't been on the show yet.
I know. I tend to always think of great guests when I don't need great guests at the moment. So, I need to start a list. But of course, we're talking about Carol Reed's The Third Man. And this is a story I'm going to try very hard to sum up in a succinct way. But it is the story of Holly Martins, played by Joseph Cotten, who has to travel to visit his friend Harry Lime in Vienna. This is post-war Vienna. And discovers that upon arrival, the Harry Lime is dead. And that there was an accident and he has died. And yet, said accident is a little bit suspicious. Holly cannot let it go and decides to try to figure out his friend's possible murder. And along the way, as he talks to various people, he finds out that there was an unknown third man at the accident. Concurrently, he ends up in a quasi-romantic relationship. It's kind of unclear of the dynamic, if it's love, if it's kind of this connection to Harry or what, but he meets Harry's girlfriend, casual acquaintance, F-buddy, however you want to define it, Anna, played by Alida Valli, and they decide to start investigating this together. I had never seen this movie. I know, the look on your face says it all. It's one of those movies that I think has been talked about so extensively, and I already knew the twist because it's been parodied and discussed so often that it's one of those films that I feel like I had seen through other things that had referenced it, but I had never actually sat down for it. And I understand now why they call it the best Hitchcock film Hitchcock never made. There's a lot of that Hitchcockian mien to it that's very, very fascinating. Of course, there's a lot of Orson Welles connection to it, considering Cotten and Wells doing Citizen Kane. We will get into spoilers. I'm just going to say it's impossible to talk about this movie without talking spoilers. So if you don't want to know the twists, please go watch The Third Man and then come back and listen to this episode. But Jeremy,
for everyone else, statute of limitations is over. It's been almost 80 years.
Very true. I usually don't give spoiler warnings because, yeah, these movies are over 50 years old. Like, you've had time. What is your background with this? Do you remember the first time you watched The Third Man?
Oh, sure. I knew about it's one of the rare classic movies I didn't first learn about from The Simpsons. I learned about it from the AFI 100 Years documentary, in which it's ranked in the top 60, something within that area, which is surprising because everybody thinks of The Third Man first as a British movie. And I'll go into why I feel it has every right to be considered an American film, but it is a co-production between Britain and Alexander Korda, and America represented by David O. Selznick. So I first heard of it from that, but I didn't get to it until end of my freshman year of high school, when I finally was like, okay, I've got the old Criterion of this. I will check this out. And I watched it and I was just like, oh my God, I've just seen one of the best movies I've ever seen. And my reaction to it every time I've watched it since has been pretty consistently like, why am I not watching this every year of my life? So watching it again for this podcast reminded me of just what a masterpiece it is. And again, if you have not seen this movie, change that immediately.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. Carol Reed, I know him more for, I think, a lot of the films he did later in life, kind of the films that I don't think we would want to associate. Oliver is the one that I kind of knew was his big film, and also The Agony of the Ecstasy, the later, type of films. Trapeze is another one. And he is often cited as one of those auteurs where there is debate on whether he should have retired early, that struggled to acclimate to the fall of the studio system. And yet, to watch this movie and to see how skillful he is in that Robert Krasker cinematography, you're kind of surprised that he wasn't making American film and working as extensively in that time as he was. Before he had done this, he did The Fallen Idol, which is another kind of unsung gem that I think I had seen before this. So he has a real great sense of mood and tone. And I think in the landscape of film noir, where there is this kind of moodiness, it's a movie that's aged impeccably well. And I don't know if that's a good thing in the times that we are here in America, because it is really a story about the surveillance state. How everybody's watching everybody else, everybody's acting differently. Nobody wants to be a witness or to take party to these conversations. It's a movie that is filled with fear. And yet, it's not fear of specific characters, although there is that, but fear of the system, of post-war Vienna, and how, even though the war is over, there's still a lot of things lurking in the shadows to be afraid of.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is very much a film about the United States in the wake of the Second World War, because we, except for the attack on Pearl Harbor, which occurred well off of American shores, the United States was not directly impacted by the warfare of the Second World War. We got to go in late and win the dang thing, and all of a sudden we are the lords and masters of the post-war order. We're organizing everything. And meanwhile, Europe is in ruins and will take a generation to recover from. So Lime is very much the innocent, naive American who walks into all of this, and he really can't comprehend what he's gotten into, not just because his intellectual faculties are lacking, certainly in comparison to Lime, but because this is just not something that he has any experience with in American life. So when he goes to see it, he is, I think, really thrown for a loop by it.
Yeah, Joseph Cotten is really good. He always played everyman, right? He could play villains, he could play heroes, he could play side guys, he could play leading men, and yet he's always a solid, reliable force that doesn't overshadow a narrative. And I think you need that. You need a guy that's going to blend into the scenery if you need him to. And when Holly shows up at the beginning of this movie, it's funny that they continually make this assertion or implication that he's not a real author. He talks about how he's writing books, but he writes westerns, right? And at one point he goes to talk to a book club and they're asking him these kind of deep questions about literature. And he's just like, yeah, I don't really know. I read Zane Grey, which in the landscape of American, European relations, I think that says a lot, that he's a guy that writes about escapism and manifest destiny and America coming in and corralling and conquering the West. And yet these people are like, that's not real literature. Like, that's not anything that endures. And you would think that it doesn't hold. You're kind of like, what is the point of this in this narrative? And yet it really is calling back to this dichotomy that America is this little boy with a cowboy hat on that is running all around talking about how they're going to ride the range when these people have suffered atrocities that we were still dealing with and still kind of figuring out even 10 years after.
The irony, of course, is that British directors who came of age right after the Second World War all loved Westerns growing up, and people like Mike Leigh and Terrence Davies all cited that as one of the things that excited them the most when they thought about America. But it's interesting that for the characters in this film, the politics of the Western are obviously very complicated, much more complicated than I think somebody like Holly Martins realizes. But it's interesting that given Europe's own history of colonization, they seem to have no interest in hearing about it in another form or in another context.
100%. And it's kind of akin to the fact that I think filmmaking, too, in general, you look at the Hollywood star system kind of making Westerns and these movies that are pulp, that are cheap kind of bits of popcorn fare, and that this is not that, which I think is ironic considering Carol Reed's background. Some of his earliest films that he made were kind of these quota quickies, which were very low budget, slapdash kind of productions that you could kind of pump out. And I think it also is kind of commenting on Hollywood's responsibility or lack thereof to the war. I mean, yes, the 1940s is, in US filmmaking at least, is synonymous with, you could argue either propaganda or patriotism of movies of the 1940s. And yet I think what Reed is kind of commenting on is that those movies are also selling a fantasy. They were selling this idea of international cooperation, Americans coming together, people uniting against a common enemy. And in this movie, you don't know, there's so many enemies, right? There's the immediate question of who killed Harry Lime, but then there's this whole overarching shadowy system that you'll never know who the real villain is. So I do wonder too if there is a commentary to be made about this movie commenting on American filmmaking.
I think that's very interesting. I certainly never thought about it that way. I do like that you brought up the quota quickies, because I think they're like, for people who are watching this and have never heard of that term, that was basically film school for Carol Reed and the entire generation that came after him, because British filmmaking lagged so far behind America in terms of how much it was producing that the government literally gave the film studios a quota for how many films they could make in a given year. And so people like Reed and David Lean, who started as an editor, and Hitchcock were just churning out these very, very cheap movies, almost like the indie movement of that time. And it was Alexander Korda who would go on to produce The Third Man, who ended up giving British film a kind of international stature when he made The Private Life of Henry VIII. So he was getting together for this film with the most prominent American independent director, independent producer, David Selznick, who had done Gone with the Wind, among other things. And I think it's interesting that this has more in common with independent film than it does with any Hollywood film, just as Citizen Kane is much more of an independent film in its spirit than anything that surrounded it at that time.
But the producer in classic film is such an integral part that we don't have the same connections to, I think, in American filmmaking. Certainly not today, let alone, I think, even in the last 10, 15 years, where a producer like a Selznick, like a Korda, really was the driving force behind a feature. And, Korda is a fascinating character in the same vein as a Selznick. And he, from what I read, Korda took a shine to Reed, and Reed had gotten out of the war. He did serve, and I think that there was a real kind of cinematic, inspirational spark to his connections with Korda. So he did Odd Man Out in 47 with James Mason, that's now considered a classic. He does The Fallen Idol, and then he does this. So that's a hell of a trio of film, I think, to be making in a 3-year period. And then after this, I think he takes a 2-year break and comes back in 51. And, some have argued that Reed after the 50, Reed was never as good as this movie after that, which I want to put a pin in that and come back to that in a second. But I mean, how do you look at Reed's post-war work, this run of 3 films?
Well, having only seen Odd Man Out and Fallen Idol once each time, I can't really speak to that as well. But I can speak to the overall mood of these films, which is really that of cynicism. These are not films where things work out. These are films that deal really with the loss of innocence, especially in The Fallen Idol, which is about a young boy. I think that this is a type of filmmaking that could only have come after the Second World War, when people were delusioned, just as the end of the First World War 30 years prior had brought about a similar kind of disillusionment among a generation of writers who couldn't believe just the sheer level of carnage that they had witnessed.
Yeah, The Fallen Idol, I think, is a even greater example, I think, of that loss of innocence, because it is the story of a young boy who kind of believes that the person that he's idealized might be a murderer. And it's definitely one worth watching. And here, even though Holly Martins is a grown man, the way that the movie chips away at his American confidence, I think, is really captivating. He comes in and he thinks that he's going to get a job and it's going to be this life-changing event, and then he gets immediately hit with death, kind of implying where the movie is going to end. And he thinks that, much like I'm sure a variety of Hollywood movies have taught people like him, solve the crime, investigate, you can do this, one man, PI. And the more he gets enmeshed in the political structure of post-war Vienna, the more he becomes disillusioned, I think, with government and politics in general. There's a real back and forth with him and Major Calloway, played by Trevor Howard, which, if you've only seen Trevor Howard in Brief Encounter, it's a very different role for him, where he is kind of leading this police force. And as Holly becomes closer to Anna, who is an illegal immigrant hiding out in Vienna, she has forged documents. And the fact that she is, as far as Holly knows, a good person and is trying to just live her life, he becomes increasingly convinced, trying to be that guy to change the system, to convince Calloway that everything, is going to be good. You should leave her alone. And yet it doesn't work. Everything he tries throughout this movie does not work. And it continues to perpetuate this idea that, like, can one man save, can one man fix a broken system? Can one American man fix a broken geopolitical system that in many ways they kind of contributed to?
It's the classic film noir trope of man who is constantly behind the villains.
Right?
And again, this is a kind of thing that, like, Humphrey Bogart, if he was Holly Martin, would never be that far behind. He would be ahead of Trevor Howard. And I think this is where the casting of Cotton is really perfect, because Joseph Cotton, by being an everyman, by not having the kind of distinct personality that a Cary Grant or a Jimmy Stewart had, it meant that you could fit him into a role like Holly Martin and you would believe that he really was this guy. Whereas somebody like a Bogart or a Robert Ryan or someone like that, they're too smart to play that character. They radiate too much intelligence.
100%. And Joseph Cotton also was kind of coming off of a pretty strong run of features at this point. He had done Portrait of Jenny, he had done Duel in the Sun, Love Letters. He was very much kind of being sold as this swoony romantic lead after playing Uncle Charlie in Shadow of a Doubt and working with Orson Welles on Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons, he really becomes this dashing, romantic leading man. And here he gets to go back to that dark world that Hitchcock and that Welles had given him. He makes this movie in 1949. He had 2 more movies after that. He does Under Capricorn and Beyond the Forest. And then some would also argue that Cotton never got a role as great as this again. He does Niagara in 1953, but that's not necessarily a Joseph Cotton movie. That's a Marilyn Monroe movie. So I think that this was really the last gasp for Cotton to have that kind of swoony, romantic leading man type of character in a dark and shadowy film.
Yes, but don't forget one thing, which is the breakout for Joseph Cotton. Not a lot of people know this, was that he originated the role that Cary Grant would later play, Dexter Haven, in the Broadway production of the Philadelphia Story opposite Katharine Hepburn. That was the thing that got him to Hollywood. And Orson Welles always insisted that he had the comedic chops to do anything that Cary Grant could do, and found himself instead trying to be typecast as a romantic lead for David Selznick.
And Selznick is a complicated figure. You know, there's, for every good thing he did, he made about 15 decisions where I'm just like, what the hell were you thinking, my man? Like,
my elementary school in Los Angeles was the Willows in Culver City, which was built out of the remnants of what was once the Selznick backlot. So people used to ask me as a kid, where do you go to school? And I would say, I go to school where they shot The Burning of Atlanta and Gone with the Wind. No joke.
That is so cool. That is so, I didn't know that. But I think you also need kind of this basic everyman, because everybody else in this movie is an international actor. Trevor Howard, yes, he had Brief Encounter, but not necessarily a household name to Americans. And Alida Valli as Anna, again, not a big name then and now. She was considered the next Garbo. Didn't exactly live up to that. Came from Italy. And I think that her character is really so magnetic. She's got such a fantastic film noir look to her, and she doesn't fit that film noir femme fatale mold. There's questions about how much her relationship with Lime is out of convenience, out of the desire to maybe get out of the country, and how much of it is genuine. And we can talk about that at the end in the final sequence about, is it love or not? But I think she's really good here.
She really is. And she brings the right energy to the part, because you really aren't sure of her motives. And I think you're right that much of her relationship with Lime is out of convenience. It's hard not to feel like there is some kind of affection for him, because as Welles plays him, he is so magnetic and charismatic that you understand why a woman would fall in love with him. There is, within that kind of love triangle as it is between Cotton, her, and Welles, a lot of people have posited that there is some kind of latent gay subtext between Cotton and Welles's characters. I'm not quite sure that that is the case. I think there's rumors that Selznick was frightened of that being an interpretation, and I'm sure that it was commented on, but I don't think it's relevant to the overall theme of the film. What is interesting to me is that both of them desire the same woman, and it's tough to tell whether Cotton really loves her or he loves her because Harry loves her.
I mean, I'm usually the first one to champion homoeroticism in classic film. But yeah, I would agree. I don't necessarily get that vibe here, aside from the fact that they both share an affection for the same woman. I think had you cast maybe a Cary Grant, somebody that was often considered more pretty or ambiguous sexually, maybe you could make that argument, but I don't necessarily see it here. And trust me, usually the first one to see it.
Of course.
But I mean, you introduced it. I'd say, like, we're 25 minutes in, like, let's talk about it. So of course, we find out that Harry Lime is alive and well, and is Orson Welles. And I think I find him as a character to be so unique even today, because I don't feel especially in old Hollywood time, we know that people were delineated into black hats and white hats, right? It was very easy to tell who's a villain, who's a hero. And Harry Lime is one of those characters that we see a lot of today. I think we have a lot of Harry Limes out in the world right now. As Holly is investigating, this is a friend that we don't really know much about their friendship. We don't know what has gone on behind the scenes of their dynamic, and he just knows that this is a good man. And by extent, Holly is a good man as far as he knows. He believes he is a good man. And when he discovers that Harry Lime has been selling antibiotics at inflated prices and they're watered down and they're killing people, he starts to realize like maybe he didn't know this guy at all. And I think that having Harry Lime be not just an opportunist, because if you think about it, go back to Gone with the Wind. The original conception of Rhett Butler is as a blockade runner. He's a guy that's taking stuff, taking food, and taking supplies, and then kind of selling them and making money off of providing essential services. Does that make Rhett Butler a villain? That's the argument. And I think here with Lime, when Holly discovers what he's doing, it reconfigures their entire dynamic, right? We don't know what that dynamic is. We haven't seen scenes like Charles Foster Kane in Citizen Kane where we've seen him evolve. But because Holly believes he's a good man, the people he associates with should be good. And that just rocks his worldview.
Well, it brings to mind, I can't tell whether this is a coincidental, but I don't think it is, which is, I think structurally, one of the key models for the third man is Heart of Darkness, which interestingly enough, Orson Welles wanted to make before he made Citizen Kane. The first thing that he pitched to RKO was Heart of Darkness with, I believe, himself playing Colonel Kurtz.
Yes.
And Third Man is very much like that in that we are waiting to get to Harry Lime until the very end. Now, what we know about Kurtz going into Heart of Darkness is that he is this really great intellectual that people are afraid of. And then by the time Marlowe has gone up the river to get him, something has snapped. And we later realize, as Brando says it in Apocalypse Now, that what horrified him was the kids getting vaccinated and then getting their arms cut off. We never know what happened to Harry to make him break bad, as it were. Again, another character is very much influenced by Harry Lime and Walter White, but something must have happened for him to throw away all of his morality because he knows what he's doing and he doesn't care. Very interestingly enough, I don't know if there are any Breaking Bad fans out there, but violence against children is one of the key turning points in that show as well. So for those of you who've seen it, you probably know the episode I'm referring to. I'll try to stick with the third man for now. It does also make you think, with the Heart of Darkness of it all, that you wish that when Martin Sheen got up the river, he was meeting Harry Lime, somebody so intellectual and fearful, rather than a 300-pound Brando who hasn't read the script, let alone read Heart of Darkness to begin with.
Well, I mean, I think you're saying something because remember, Holly's going to leave. He's done. Like at a certain point, he decides he's going to leave. And it's once Calloway shows him the children that are affected that Holly decides that he's going to try to help to bring Lime down. And I think
that's the breaking point for
yes,
him.
yeah.
Because before that, he's still trying to find a way to preserve the relationship.
Yes, and of course, Anna, the Alita Valley character, even once she knows this information, is still very much on Lime's side. It's a question of, is it Stockholm Syndrome? Is it some sort of power dynamic that keeps her believing that this person, is a good man? Or is it just what I think we've come to see in the world, which is that some people just willingly put blinders on and do not want to believe what they don't want to believe? I would have loved to have known what audiences in 1949 thought in seeing that reveal of Orson Welles with the cat in that alley, because you don't know for a beat or two what the connection is. You're just watching it like, oh, that's Orson Welles. Orson Welles is in this movie. Oh, that's right. And then they take a second before he says Harry, and you put two and two together. I would have loved to have known what audiences in 49 immediately thought upon seeing that sequence, like how quickly it took them to realize, oh, it's Lime and he's not dead.
It's one of the greatest entrances in all of film, and Orson Welles later recalled that when he was working on the film, Carol Reed just took a little bit of time at the end of every single shooting day just to get it right. It was not one of those things where they blocked aside one day to do it. They just went back to it every day until they finally nailed it.
And Selznick, if memory serves, did not necessarily want Welles. Welles was kind of this enfant terrible, with the issues with Citizen Kane and the issues with Magnificent Ambersons, was often considered more of a pain in the ass on a set than he was worth.
And if Welles is to be believed, one night he fucked up playing charades with Selznick, and Selznick never forgave him for it.
But Selznick wanted Noel Coward to play the part, which that is the most bizarre casting suggestion to me. I've heard a lot of weird ones, but I just don't know. Because I think with Welles, it's not just what the audience knows about Welles. It's not all of the other characters he's played, but it is that physical intimidation, that beguiling smile that he gives when he's in the alley, where you're just like, oh yeah. If it was Noel Coward like crouching in the corner, I'd have been like, yeah. And I think the fact that the audience knows Welles, that is important. Name recognition, unfortunately, for an American audience would have been vital. I think that had you cast someone like Coward that is so synonymous with Europe and Britain, and I think American audiences would be hard-pressed to know what he looked like, you would have lost all impact.
I think it's interesting. I think Coward would have pulled the acting of it off. I don't think he would have been as good as Welles. But what is interesting to me is that they kept trying to get him to play villains in various films, because he was the original choice for Dr. No.
Yes.
In the first James Bond film, and just wrote back. He knew Ian Fleming because they both had homes in Jamaica, but when they asked him to do it, he just wrote back, no, no, no. So I do think that would have been really interesting, but in order for the movie to work, in order to justify the length of time it takes to get to this guy, it has to be somebody larger than life. It has to be Welles. And I think that outside of his own work, this was the greatest acting he ever did, like hands down.
Of course, I have to ask the question because it's one that I think people still debate to this day, but there is a very real argument that continues to be popped up about how Welles is actually the real director of this movie. It's been debated. Jonathan Rosenbaum wrote in 2007 that it was a popular misconception, but that there were similar themes. But others have said that Welles had a directorial hand. It would have been impossible for him not to have tried to direct. Where do you fall on those discussions?
I think this is Carol Reed's movie. I think that Orson Welles was a valuable contributor to the film. I think there is enough evidence that he rewrote some of his own lines. I would believe that. But this is Carol Reed's work. And while Orson did, I think, at times try to take credit towards the end of his life, he was like, this was Carol's work. Carol loved working with actors. He was a great collaborator. The irony is, I think a lot of people were annoyed by Orson's behavior on set because he probably did do his usual shtick of, are you really going to put the camera there?
Well, I think Bogdanovich most recently was one of the few that says, well, if anything, Carol Reed was influenced by Welles. He said in an introduction to the DVD, quote, I think it's important to note that the look of The Third Man, and in fact the whole film, would be unthinkable without Citizen Kane, The Stranger, and The Lady from Shanghai, all of which Orson made in the 40s and all of which preceded The Third Man. Carol Reed, I think, was definitely influenced by Orson Welles, the director, from the films he have made. And I have to think that's kind of a backhanded compliment, the fact that Reed had to be influenced by Welles. And I think that that's something that you could ascribe to maybe any noir act. I mean, noir by its very definition has a specific look. So to say that Reed was influenced directly by Welles, you would have to argue that any filmmaker, I think, of the 1940s would have been influenced by Welles, because the look is so ingrained.
Oh, I think that's a very good point. I definitely agree that he is influenced by Wells, but I do think that Reed is underappreciated, at least in the United States, as a director. And I think ascribing that sort of, oh, well, everybody's influenced by Orson mentality to him underrates his achievements in this film.
I think it does, and Reed tried very hard to kind of play ball with U.S. filmmaking. He went into CinemaScope in '56 and when he did Trapeze, and it was a success, but he could never really get the budgets that he wanted. He was gonna do a remake of Mutiny on the Bounty in '62 with MGM, but Marlon Brando got cast, and Brando was not gonna, much like Wells, was not going to cede control, and the two argued, and eventually Reed left and was replaced by Louis Milestone. So I think Reed is one of those that, I could be putting words in his mouth, but certainly felt more comfortable with the British filmmaking system because they were able to create their auteurs, right? You come to America and get into American filmmaking by the 50s and 60s, the auteurs have already kind of been decided. It's harder to break in and establish your own vision when the big guns are already there and then everybody else is just a journeyman director.
I think that's a really good point. And I think that he unfortunately was trying to break into the system just as it was fracturing.
Oh, yeah.
Because, like, the time this movie came out, the system was at maybe the strongest it ever was. And all you have to do is look at the Best Director nominees in 1950 because Reed was among them. And it may not even be the best directed movie in the category. That is how good it was because he was up against Joe Mankiewicz for All About Eve and Billy Wilder for Sunset Boulevard and Cukor for Born Yesterday and John Huston for Asphalt Jungle. So these are like 5 movies where everybody is at the absolute top of their game. But unfortunately, I think Reed tried to break into it just as television and widescreen and the emphasis on technology over storytelling was starting to come into play.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that he was part of that big 1950s Oscar push where you have just some of, I mean, we always argue on this podcast about the 1950 Oscars because so many people deserved their flowers. And of course, this was one of them. This did win for cinematography, which, good on it. But when you think about where else it was nominated, Mankiewicz wins Best Director for All About Eve. It was also nominated for film editing, which weirdly it lost to King Solomon's Mines. That seems like the most bizarre decision in the history of decisions.
Studio balloting. The studios basically took your ballot if you were a below line person and just had you vote the studio line. That's how you get stuff like that.
That is hilarious. To go back to Wells in this movie, Wells, I think...
one more thing I want to say, going back to
yeah.
the 1950 Oscars. I don't mean to interrupt, but I live in Washington, D.C., and if I take the bus down 16th Street, I pass by the hotel where the play and the movie of Born Yesterday takes place. It's just a stone's throw away from the White House.
I love that. We love Born Yesterday on this podcast, so shout out to everybody watching Born Yesterday. But to go back to Orson Welles in this movie, I kept watching this with a contemporary mentality and was like, he's a lot like Thanos, if you really think about it, in the sense that he does not understand or is unwilling to understand humanity. He talks when they're in that Ferris wheel funicular thing, and him and Holly are talking, and he talks about people as little dots, and that it's not going to make a difference if one or two of them disappear. It's very much,
and that's very Colonel Kurtz. That is very much drop the bomb, exterminate the brutes.
Exactly. So it's a character, I think, that again has aged, unfortunately, impeccably well, because you can connect his lack of empathy for humanity to so many other villains we've talked about throughout cinema. If it sounds like Wells wrote a lot of his own dialogue, because I think he has such a flair for it. And if you've ever doubted Orson Welles' mastery as a performer, you just need to watch his sequences in this movie and you will understand 100% what a master he was. He has that amazingly fantastic speech where he said, in Italy for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. And in Switzerland, they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. I think even if you didn't know, you've heard that speech, you've heard that punchline, and you hadn't seen the movie before, I think to hear it, where we are today, is so vital because I'm a millennial. We always joke that we're just living through trauma after trauma after trauma. And yet, do we have the art to show for it? I think that's the thing. You look at something, to go back to Heart of Darkness, you look back at Vietnam, and I think that the 60s and 70s, the art scene, the music, the movies, a lot of people feel that that is because of what people experienced in Vietnam. And so watching Harry Lime talk about that, I was like, we've lived through the Borgias, but we still only have the Cuckoo Clock. It's an impeccable speech. It's impeccable.
It is incredible. I think we're all so traumatized right now that we're trying to filter everything through the lens, maybe too much of our own politics. And I'm like, maybe we need to let this sit for a little bit before we jump in.
Exactly. We haven't even talked about Graham Greene, screenwriter for this. This was a novella that he kind of wanted to transition into a film treatment, kind of like Love Story, if anybody knows the history of Love Story. Did it start as a book? Did it start as a script? Why not both?
Oh, can I say one thing about that?
Go for it.
Okay, I just want to plug this because I don't know if there are any people who listen to this podcast who either went to Harvard or want to go there. But if you ever do, New Student Week, they have a screening of Love Story, which was shot there, which they treat like Rocky Horror. And it is one of the greatest things I have ever seen. It is the only way to watch that movie.
It is I will agree with you. It's the only way to watch. It's the only way to watch that movie. Graham Greene, I know, had issues with Selznick about how the movie was going to transition. And the third act of this movie is one where they really don't necessarily want to kill Lime. Lime is one of those that doesn't want to be put in a cage. He doesn't want to be confined. Selznick was constantly trying to change the ending.
I didn't know that. I know that Selznick had real issues with some of the film, and as we know, the movie was recut substantially when it came to the United States, most notably the opening narration, which, if you watch it today, Carol Reed is the original narrator, but Selznick had it rewritten and replaced with some lame Joseph Cotton narration for American audiences to see. But no, Selznick drove writers crazy. Like, it's one of the reasons why Sidney Howard did not want to stay in LA to write Gone with the Wind. He wanted to go back and write it in New England, which he did, because he was just so annoyed having to take Selznick's notes on everything. But I do think it's interesting that there was huge debate over whether or not to kill Lime at the end, because the way the story works, he has to die. And I'm not just saying that because of the fact that the production code was a thing at the time. It's because in order for Holly to really come full circle, he can't just let him go.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing, too, one of the other elements that Selznick wanted changed was the ultimate final sequence. So in the way the movie ends right now, Holly goes to Lime's second funeral. He had gone to the first one, and he waits. He sees Anna on the road to the cemetery, and he wants to speak to her, and he thinks she's going to stop. And she walks past him, and that's how the movie ends. And Selznick supposedly was not down with that. He wanted them to end up together. He wanted this happy ending. And I think that this ending is so necessary. It's the only way. If Lime dying is the only way this can end, Anna being the one person that's going to die with the lie, or at least ignore what she knows and feel that she is the bigger person because she's not going to associate with Lime's killer. That says so much. And I'm curious how you take the ending, because I had thoughts about that final image and the fact that it is Anna that makes this choice as a woman going into post-war Vienna to say, like, I'm going to support this man, even though I know he's bad. And maybe because we've lived in a post-Me Too world, I'm like, how do you take the final image in Anna's decision at the end of the movie?
Well, going back to it, I think to understand the ending, it does require understanding what comes before, which is the sewer chase. But before I get to that, I think one thing which really strikes me about this film is the fact that the entire movie is trying to throw you off center. It doesn't act the way that any other noir does. It uses the Dutch angles. It uses the zither music. Everything is about throwing you off because it's about throwing Holly off. And so it's interesting to me that the very end of the movie is almost kind of a subversion of the Western, because there's this huge chase through the sewers to get to Lyme, which is masterfully put together. And at the very end of it, it's Holly who has to be the one to kill Harry Lyme. And when you see Holly emerge from having fired the shot, it's almost like he is a cowboy coming out after the very last duel. But what we would normally expect at the end of a Western for the woman to come out and embrace him, that doesn't happen at all. So I think the decision is to subvert both the audience's expectation, but also to subvert Holly's, because at the end of it, he's kind of getting to be the protagonist of a story that he might write, but any satisfaction of doing that is denied to him. And I also just think I understand exactly why she walks by him. He killed the one man who she probably ever loved, as messed up as he was. So I think closure has to be denied there in order for the movie to really work.
Exactly. I'm glad I got to see this. I'm glad that I got to see it, and I'm glad I got to talk to you about it. Because it's definitely one of those that I think you have to sit with. You know, you really need to ponder, and they don't make movies like this anymore, right? I mean, they don't.
No.
I'm glad that I finally got to see this, and that it's closing out International Month. Jeremy, what are your final thoughts on The Third Man?
Yeah, I want to take a few minutes on the one stipulation that I made when I asked if I could be on this podcast, which is to talk about, as a millennial, as a 90s kid, I have to bring up, well, one of the great episodes of Pinky and the Brain, The Third Mouse. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Pinky and the Brain was a show that was a spinoff of Animaniacs about two mice. One is a genius, the other's insane. The genius mouse, the brain, is voiced by a legendary actor named Maurice LaMarche, who is famous because he does a dead-on Orson Welles imitation.
Oh, yeah.
Up to the point where when other actors play Orson Welles in movies, Maurice LaMarche comes in to do the dialogue touch-ups because it's so dead-on. And because they had him on Animaniacs, and because these guys who wrote it were so smart, they just went all out on doing Orson Welles episodes. Like, there's an episode, the famous Orson Welles radio outtakes, where he's reading the radio copy and being like,
I remember that.
"No, for Christ's sake, I wouldn't direct any living actor in Shakespeare like this." They did a Pinky and the Brain episode that is literally just the brain reading the copy. But the apotheosis of this is The Third Mouse, which is a 15-minute black and white parody of The Third Man, which captures it perfectly. Like, watching it again after watching The Third Man, they drew all the characters from the movie as mice really well. And they kind of nail the way in which the brain is constantly ahead of Pinky as Holly Martin's. He's so dense and unable to understand that everybody's telling him Harry is dead. But of course, the brain is there. And to have Maurice just going full on Orson Welles, it's the kind of thing that animation is afraid to do now. I remember when Zootopia 2 came out, they were like, well, we cut this Silence of the Lambs reference because we thought people wouldn't get it. And I'm like, Animaniacs and The Simpsons and all this stuff were spoofing things that I only know about because I watched them on this show. Treat your audiences with respect, you guys.
I talk all the time about how I only knew It's a Wonderful Life from the episode of the Rugrats where Chucky wishes he was never born. I think that classic cartoons really did create a generation of classic film fans because it was just introducing that landscape. And I'll put a link in the show notes to people that want to find out more about The Third Mouse and want to enjoy more Pinky and the Brain, because we need to all enjoy Pinky and the Brain. But Jeremy, thank you so much for taking this cinematic vacation with me to the UK and talking Orson Welles. Where can fans find you online? Anything they should know about that you have coming up?
Oh, of course. I post on social media probably more than I should, but you can find me on X. I'm currently writing a Substack at jfassler.com that is called The Big Board. I am mostly writing about contemporary politics and historical, but I am also publishing culture writing as well. So if you want to take a look at my work, go there. You can find my portfolio, my articles in the Times. If you just look me up, I'm always around.
And of course, the podcast is on Ticklish Biz on all social media, unless it's Twitter, where we're at Ticklish_Biz. And I am at Kristen K. Lopez, except Instagram, where I am at KristenLopez88. And if you like my thoughts on classic and contemporary films, you can head over to my newsletter, The Film Maven, and subscribe at thefilmmaven.com. And if you want to support Ticklish Biz in its 10th year, we have a Patreon specifically for the show at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. We just had a mixer in June. We're going to have another Zoom mixer in August. Do all sorts of fun stuff over there. And our YouTube channel, it's blossoming. You can find that at youtube.com/@ticklishbusiness. We will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Till then.